You're listening to Rawthentic Leadership, a series of conversations, insights and inspirations with leaders who are real, raw and authentic. Today, I bring you an invigorating and insightful conversation with Dr Kirstin Ferguson AM, leader, journalist and author, her latest book being Head and Heart, The Art of Modern Leadership. The time flew by in our discussion and Kirstin was so generous, humble and funny with her stories of her career, insights and lessons learned, and her take on modern leadership. Enjoy! My first encounter with Dr Kirstin Ferguson AM was in experiencing her moderate a masterclass with Jim Collins of Good to Great fame. And I believe I learned equally from both on that day as I listened to Kirstin field questions and just the way that she explored greater depths with Jim. Dr. Kirstin Ferguson AM is an award-winning leadership expert, an author, a columnist, and company director. Her career includes 3 decades of senior leadership experience, including a previous appointment by the Australian Prime Minister as both acting chair and deputy chair of the ABC, which is the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Kirstin has previously been the CEO of a global consulting firm, was a senior executive at a leading corporate law firm, and spent nearly 10 years as an officer in the Royal Australian Airforce. She's also making a global impact, being named as one of the world's top 30 thinkers to watch, and she was shortlisted for the Distinguished Award in Leadership in 2021. And that is an extremely cut down bio, believe you me. She's a passionate advocate for women, for diversity and inclusion, and was recently recognised for her significant service to business and gender equality through being awarded an AM, which is a member of the Order of Australia. Our topic of conversation today is based on Kirstin's second and best-selling book, which is literally flying off the shelves, called Head and Heart, The Art of Modern Leadership, and a conversation I am so looking forward to. Kirstin, a very, very warm welcome to Rawthentic Leadership.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here with you.
I know. I'm very excited. I'll try and curb my enthusiasm.
I'm excited too. We're all excited.
So I've realised, sort of looking back on past podcasts, is my curiosity around sort of how you got to be where you are today. What a little bit about your career journey, which is extremely eclectic. So before sort of delving into the topic of leading with Head and Heart, I'd love to hear a little more about your journey from, I know it was a while ago, but, almost 10 years in the military and then sort of leapfrogging into a global law firm. So what were some of the key lessons for you along the way?
Yeah, I'm really lucky to have had a diverse career. And I look at some people who have had, the same number of years with the same employer, obviously in different roles. And I can't even imagine that because I've kind of gone in every which way direction. But together, they've all sort of added to my experiences along the way. So, yeah, I joined the military when I was only 17. Went from a private girls' school in Sydney to the Australian Defence Force Academy, which was, a massive culture shock. But was fortunate to do really well there and ended up duxing my graduating class. And so got posted to an F-111 squadron up in Queensland, where I was a total Top Gun cliche and met my now husband of 25 years on the second day, and he was flying F-111s.
Oh my goodness.
I know, so it's like out of a movie, but I can assure you the thrill of that wears off.
I've got to ask quickly, did you have a call sign?
Well, he did, and it was very boring based on his surname, but I really loved my time in the Air Force, but I always knew I was going to do something else. And so I started studying law as soon as I'd graduated from ADFA and went off to a corporate law firm and got admitted as a lawyer, but had realized I really loved leading people. And so I on doing that rather than practicing. And then ended up becoming CEO of a group of psychologists, again, another massive culture change, before pursuing a career in boards. And, I think people ask me now about career planning and, how to set yourself a sort of strategy for the future. And I could never have predicted all the
Yeah.
zigzagging I would have done. But I look back now and it's all led to the next thing, to the next thing. And I think being prepared to say yes to different opportunities is incredibly important, even if they're terrifying at the time.
I was just going to say that. I mean, that takes courage. I thought jumping from hospitality into IT took courage, but yours is a whole nother level.
Yeah.
So what then if you were to pick a thread through that of in each of the zigs and the zags that you made? What, if anything, was there a common thread either in your attitude or your desire or something that made that feel right?
Yeah. That's a really interesting question. I think leadership, either being a leader or being fascinated about leadership, actually has been there since day one. And my very first degree was a history degree, and I did an honours year, and my thesis was looking at the leadership of the WAF in World War II here and in the
Ah,
UK. So, I think even at that young age of 20, and here I turn 50 next month, I've been fascinated by this idea of what makes an effective leader. So that has definitely been a thread, but I've always wanted to practice as a leader as well, and so have
yeah.
had that opportunity the same amount of time. I think the other thing that's probably allowed me to do that is that sense of, I mean, I suffer from imposter syndrome just like everyone else. And probably at all of those different turning points have thought, oh, I can't possibly do this, or how will that sort of work out? But then a louder voice in me says, well, you've got no reason to think you're going to fail, just go and do it anyway. So I think there's no doubt that there's been points where I've wondered what's going to happen and is this going to be a screaming disaster.
Hmm.
But there must be an internal drive and self-efficacy around your capability that I think really helps me get through.
Absolutely. And for that to come across for those who decided to take you on with such a varied background, to have that faith in you to invest in you.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, and that applies for everyone. Often you get offered a promotion or an opportunity and you think, that imposter voice comes up and thinks you can't do it. But trusting in others that perhaps
Hmm.
they've seen something you haven't seen yourself, I think that's been a really important message for me too.
Very much so. And looking back with that thread being leadership, the leading with head and heart, is that something that in a way has always been with you and dormant and sort of underneath the waterline, so to speak? Or has that been shaped by your experiences of being led by great leaders and not so great leaders? How has that formed for you?
Definitely has evolved. There's no way. When I was at a law firm in the late 1990s, that I was leading with my head and my heart. I think I was always someone who was trying to be authentic,
Yeah.
but also wore the suit to work and put on the armor of the kind of leader that I thought I needed to be in those
Mm.
environments to succeed. And I think, particularly in the military or places where you're in a male dominated environment and you're one of the few women, you learn to just adapt your style to the culture that will help you get on. And I think that meant suppressing, who you actually may have been. So this idea of integrating the leader you are at home and at work, that was a long way from where I was at. I mean, I'm still of the age where my young children at the time, I might have been home having to take a work call and I'd be hiding in the loo, so with the kids crying on the other side, trying to pretend they weren't there, because that wasn't okay at the time. Whereas that seems, as you laughed, it's laughable now that we would try and pretend that that wasn't part of our lives. But back then it was really important to keep work and life separate.
There's a couple of things coming in there. If I go to the most recent one first, that's something that you've got in your book about. Was it Robert Kelly? That was only
Yeah.
not long before COVID when his
The
kids came
BBC
in.
interview. And
Yeah,
remember how shocked and, we all thought, and he thought it was going to be the end of his career. It
yeah,
was only, I think, 2019.
yeah.
Now, since then, it's happened to all of us a zillion times and we couldn't care less. But that's how quickly things have changed.
And I think the other part in listening to what you were just saying was, I suppose, the two sides to adaptive leadership, because you've got the healthy adaptive leadership, and so much of the theme and the message coming across in your book, Head and Heart, is that it's not an either or. It's having everything to hand and being able to use the best attribute at the best time in the best situation. But what you just spoke about in the military was that maybe less of a healthy adaptive leadership? Was it a survival adaptive leadership?
Um, no, and I think there is a sort of stereotype about military leadership in particular, that it's all yelling and screaming and command and control, like in Platoon or those kind of movies. Whereas, yes, when I was at ADFA at that time, it was like that. But in the military itself, you were taught very early on about the need to earn the respect of those that you lead. And I was a young 21-year-old officer leading older men who'd been in the Air Force longer than I'd been alive. So you definitely have to adapt your leadership in a way that respects the contributions that those you're leading make. And there's a whole lot of humility that comes with realizing that you know nothing as well. So I think the adaptive style that I learnt was from entering different cultures. So going into the military and then going into a law firm, obviously they're just completely different ways that I needed to learn to lead that would be effective. And then going from a law firm to going to psychologists, again, you can't get two more different groups, I don't think, than lawyers and psychs. And now sitting on boards, every culture of each organization I'm involved with is different. And so leading on boards is much more about leading through influence, and you need to find the ways to adapt your styles there. So, yes, you're drawing on all the attributes of the head and the heart, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but the way you use them and when that art of modern leadership is going to be most effective will be unique in every situation.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right. There's a couple of previous guests I've had on the podcast, both in the military, that really opened my eyes about sort of how egalitarian and how caring the
Very
leadership
much so.
styles were. So yes,
And often, in previous times, everyone lived on a base together. So you did have your private life was sort of part of your life in the military as well. And I think it's taken a lot longer for, civilian organisations, the normal businesses we all work in, through the pandemic to actually accept, that we all have a life, which of course we do.
And you mentioned just then about being on boards and looking through certainly looking through your LinkedIn profile. You've been super active and in the past and still as a non-executive director. What drew you to this, and what do you get from it? And what do you give to it?
Yeah, it's such a different way of thinking and being and doing, because when you're sitting on boards, you're not implementing, you're not the doer, and you're far more removed from the day to day, but you've got an incredible responsibility and liability, obviously. And I'm not sure I really understood that when I first joined a board all those years ago. And, I would have been incredibly green back on those first boards. But what I do love is being able to lead, as I said earlier, through influence by asking really good questions and, just trying to apply your expertise to often very similar challenges, but in very different contexts. And that's what I love about sitting on boards, and by working with other people around the table who might have really different experiences to you, or different ways of tackling problems. And sometimes it can be really challenging. Board roles are really difficult, and particularly when things aren't going well. And so it brings out a whole range of other new skills that you might not necessarily practice in other parts of your life. That said, I've always needed to do something as well, because I find board roles, as I said, you're hands off, whereas I love doing. And so that's why I've always, throughout my whole board career, been doing other things, whether it's writing books or columns or doing campaigns or whatever it might be. I do a lot of public speaking. All of that is me then doing, that I miss just by going to a monthly board meeting.
You do so much, and I want to move on in a moment to the voluntary work that you do. But when you were talking about being on the board and influencing, there was something just beautiful in the book around words and wisdom. Can you share that with us, please? Because I just love it.
This is what I coin the word to wisdom ratio. I'm definitely not an auditor. There's no numbers to this, but I remember when I was first starting my board career, and I would feel I needed to contribute to pretty much every topic, and I'm sure I rattled on for far longer than was needed. Yet I was noticing at the same time that other much more senior directors around the table may say very, very little at all, but every word they said was gold. And it might just be one single question, and it would totally change the course of the conversation. And I was thinking, God, how do they do that? And it really made me think there's something about this word to wisdom ratio, and my word to wisdom ratio was not particularly healthy at the start. It took me a long time, a lot of words, to say anything and contribute any value or wisdom. Whereas these people who are much more experienced had an incredibly healthy word to wisdom ratio. And I still use that now, thinking, if I come out of a meeting or, any interaction, and you can just reflect on, well, how did I do then? And did I need to perhaps stop talking and allow space for others to contribute?
And I think I'm a first-year apprentice still.
We all are. We all are.
Is there anyone who comes to mind who, for you, embodies that word to wisdom ratio?
Well, it's funny you should say that. The one that everyone will know, I have worked on a board with Ita Buttrose for some time, and she's pretty good at using very few words to communicate precisely what she means. And so she's got a very good word to wisdom ratio.
And together with that sense of presence, yes, that must be formidable.
Yeah, no, she's fabulous.
So go back to doing. Just reading what you're into is tiring, and I just have so much admiration for you. You must be so disciplined. But you are still a crisis support worker with Lifeline, aren't you? That's the equivalent of the Samaritans. What have been some of the key lessons in that, and how you've brought your experience from your military, from your corporate career, from your work on boards? How does that help you in that role?
Well, look, I certainly don't do it to help me in my work role. I simply do it because I, feel I can hopefully add something of value to someone in their time of need. I absolutely love it because it's incredibly rewarding. It's a 3 or a 4 hour shift, and I don't think about anything else other than the person on the other end of the phone. They get your complete attention, and in every call you're leading with empathy. And so you might get a caller that is really quite challenging to listen to. They might have very different experiences or views on the world than you, yet you practice leading with empathy. The
Yeah.
questions and the way you help them through that challenge is not about you at all. It's only about the person on the other end of the phone. And I think for all of us who come from privileged backgrounds where we're fortunate to have a roof over our heads and we know where our next meal's coming from, it makes you much more alive to the lived experience of others by volunteering in this way. And so I mean, it's really rewarding.
Sorry, I did mean in your role as a crisis support worker.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the other thing I love about it is you're completely anonymous, so it doesn't matter about my experience. And in fact, anyone listening who's interested, they don't ask you anything. You don't provide a CV. It's all on your ability to connect with people. And so I loved that the other crisis support workers I would sit alongside had such diverse backgrounds. And I think it is really rewarding if anyone's thinking of doing that.
And it's so needed. So yes, I'll put the details on the show notes about Lifeline and volunteering. So one of the traits there that you talked about, sort of leading into head and heart, was empathy. It's the last chapter in your book, and oh gosh, it's such a powerful one, and really gets you thinking about empathy being a double-edged sword, and what sort of it, for want of a better word, that hard empathy, that real empathy is. But just sort of putting that aside for 1 second, can you share with us, please, that there are 8 attributes or qualities of modern day leadership that you identified, for head-based, for heart-based. How did all that come about? How did you arrive at those 8?
Yeah, and it was everything in the book is evidence-based. So I, did not want to write a leadership book that just makes up some ideas or shares my anecdotes. And so to get to the 8, I started with many, many more, and I sort of listed and went through every quality, all the good qualities that you hear about good, effective leaders. And we, in our research to develop the scale, which I did with QT Business School, started with a question set of about 54 questions. And the final scale, which I'm sure we'll talk about and love people to go and try, is 24. So the 8 have come from which of the attributes actually correlated the most with one another and with the idea of being a modern leader. And there's 4 head, 4 heart, and that's because you want balance. The whole idea that you can be all one or all the other, or that just isn't how modern leadership works. And the other thing to remind everyone before I go through them is that you have all of these. You might not think you do, and empathy is a really good example where you might think that in my job I don't get to show empathy at all, but you've got bucket loads of it at home with your family or in your community or your church or whatever it is that you enjoy doing. And it's the whole idea is of modern leadership to bring and integrate that leader that you are outside of work with the one that you are. So the 4 attributes of leading with the head, the first is curiosity, and that's really just having not just a thirst for knowledge on some things, but really on anything, and being prepared to challenge assumptions and what we thought we knew. The second is wisdom, and that's really around decision making, but it's being able to assess what's known and unknown, weighing up risk and reward and things like that. Third is perspective, and in layman's terms, that's being able to read the room. And this one of all 8 correlated the highest with all the other attributes. So if you've got this as your leading attribute, then it really is like a superpower, turbocharged for being a modern leader. And that's where you can, obviously I'm talking about, it could be a physical room, but it's more likely to be your organisation or an industry or the rest of the world. You can read signals. So anyone who's aware of the concept of Carl Wick's sense making, it's that being able to interpret signals as they come in, think a few steps ahead, and then really be able to think through the implications of decisions. And you can also see who's missing from the room as well, which is incredibly important. And then the fourth and final attribute of leading with the head is capability. And that's around having this growth mindset idea. It's being capable at obviously whatever it is you can do, but also believing you're capable and knowing that continual learning and improvement, is part of being a capable leader. So they're the 4 leading with the head, but you cannot lead just with those, although plenty of leaders try. And unfortunately, plenty of organisations also reward and recruit and promote based on those head-based attributes. But we need leaders who can also draw on those of the heart. So the 4 heart-based attributes, the first is humility, and that's obviously being willing to seek out the contributions of others, but importantly also being aware of your limitations.
Yeah.
The second is self-awareness, having that high level of insight into the impact that we have on others. Third is courage, and that's really courage to speak up for what you believe in, even in the face of pressure not to do so. And then the fourth is empathy, which we touched on. And empathy, I think it's the most misunderstood of all the attributes. It's not pity or sympathy or compassion. It's too much empathy is a problem. It can lead to confirmation bias, and it can lead to you taking on the feelings of others, which isn't healthy. But if you can potentially put yourself in the shoes of others and actually try and appreciate the lived experiences of people different to yourself, then you're much more likely to be able to lead with empathy, and you're also more likely to be able to lead around diversity and inclusion, because unless you're even accepting that some people have a different lived experience to you, that's going to be impossible.
And this was one of the things that I loved about the book, was the way that you the different correlates. So saying that, if you're strong in this particular area, then there's a correlation between this and certain other attributes. And the other thing that I love about the way that it's set out in terms of a framework for, okay, so what is this attribute? How does it benefit? And also the really important thing is, what stops us, and how do we lead? And I'd like to just, I suppose, for a moment, hone in on the what stops us, and just in your experience, in your own leadership experience, where you've either been leading or you've been led, or you've had close relationships with other leaders. What do you think stops some leaders from being able to embrace this holistic way of leading with head and heart?
I think the overriding issue is that we've had it ingrained into us for centuries that leaders are all-knowing, heroic leaders with all the answers. And if you go into leadership thinking or having that expectation, even just of yourself, then that puts a huge amount of pressure on you to be perfect and to have an answer to every problem as it comes up. And I think this ability to be aware of your limitations can be scary for some leaders. And that's when you see people who fall victim to being, the smart, needing to be seen as the smartest person in the room. And they're those diminishers, as Liz Wiseman calls them, that, take up all the space and leave no room for anyone else to have an opinion. There are a lot of leaders that fall victim to that, including ourselves. It's just part of that need to, it feels uncomfortable to say, actually, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
But then if you follow up with, I'm not exactly sure of the best way forward, but I know you've got a lot of experience in this, Claire. What do you think could work for us? Or asking questions.
Yeah.
It builds trust. So not knowing the answers is actually a relationship builder, not a relationship destroyer. And I think more and more leaders need to sort of be able to practice how that works, and then that'll really build your confidence to do it again and again.
So let's say, oh gosh, we're inviting people to complete the head and heart leader scale, and I'd love you to talk to that a little bit more. I suppose my question is around, those people who go out and buy the book. They're they're the ones who are already curious and keen to develop. So for those who sort of don't know what they don't know, so to speak, and I don't mean that from an ignorant perspective, but those people who have come along through their career with that sort of stereotypical belief around leadership, are they, in your opinion, coachable? Can we change?
Oh, it's tricky. They need to want to change. And so, often those kind of people may themselves come to realize that they're not being promoted. They're not reaching that absolute pinnacle of their career that they're looking for. And that will be because, I'm sure, they may well be just focused on all of their industry knowledge and their technical knowledge, and yet they have not invested time and energy in understanding how they could be a better human leader. I do believe everyone is coachable. My exception to that is Donald Trump. I'm just not sure that he's ever going to develop humility.
I have to be with you on that one.
I know. I think, though, that it requires, as a threshold, a willingness to want to change. And that's the same with any behavior change. You can't force that on anyone. But it's, I think it sometimes feels scarier than it's going to be in reality. And, nothing in this book or in what we're talking about is asking people to be less than. It's not asking them to lose anything about what makes them a great leader now. It's just being prepared to rethink if the way they do things now is the most effective that they can be. Is there perhaps, just perhaps, a different way you could ask for something to be done tomorrow, or a different way that you could seek feedback? Or if you're not getting feedback at all, everyone sits there quietly. Is there potentially a need for you to look in the mirror and really think about why no one is being prepared to speak up? What is it? What's your blind spot you're not seeing?
And that's so important. That brings me on to so that the head and heart leader scale, it's a self-assessment. So obviously we're answering it in the way that we believe ourselves to be.
Yes.
So have you got any plans to do a 360? I'd love to see this in a 360.
Oh, let me take a breath first. It would be fascinating because, one of the flaws of a self-assessment is, for example, humility. Humility is my number one attribute. And we haven't even said, for anyone listening, go to headheartleader.com. It takes 5 minutes. There's 24 questions and you'll get a personalized report. And I'm sure we'll talk about yours soon, Claire. But it's... the problem with, say, humility as a self-assessment is the research shows that the higher you consider yourself to be or score yourself as humble, the less likely others are to score you as humble. So that's always a rude awakening every time I look at my results and humility is number one. I think I'm probably not all that humble, but, certain aspects of humility you might be, which is always wanting to seek the contributions of others. From that perspective, I know it's true. But it is always challenging with a self-assessment. 360, I don't know. As I said, let me take a breath.
But as I was listening into a masterclass, a book review that you were doing this morning with the growth faculty, and there's a couple of things there. One that you mentioned that, if a leader then has that courageous vulnerability to go out and share their results with their people and solicit feedback from that. Can you talk to that?
Absolutely. And I notice people are sharing them on LinkedIn, their results, and it's just driving a conversation because there's no pass or fail.
Yeah.
There's no way that, you can have or be showing someone that you're no good at something, we've all got all 8 of them. All the scale will show you is how you show up in a self-assessment relative to each of those and compared to a sample group. So I think it's a perfect tool to, if you're not already getting feedback from your team, to say, look, I've gone and done this, and you guys might want to go and do it as well, totally up to you. But here it shows that I've got really high humility, but I read that that's probably not likely. What should I learn from this? Or, what areas do you think it isn't reflective of what your experience is? Because whatever little nuggets you can get from that conversation are going to be valuable. If someone says to you, actually, Kirsten, I'm surprised that your wisdom is so low because you're always so wise, you're always weighing up decisions or whatever, then your answer being so different is a really important piece of information for you to go, okay, my self-assessment of myself, and that means my self-awareness of the impact I'm having, is nothing like what I thought it was. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing. I might have undersold, or I perhaps could be well more confident than I should be on the impact.
Oh, it's absolute gold, though, especially if you're getting that sort of feedback from more than one person, to be able to self-reflect and say, okay, so what's going on here for there to be this gap in perception?
What am I missing? So I'm missing something. And we've all got blind spots, as you know. So, if you've got someone who's willing to tell you what one of those might be, thank them, because, that is gold, as you said.
Oh, yeah. And if I may offer a little observation from this morning, you inadvertently demonstrated huge amounts of humility by missing out on opportunities to promote the book.
I know. Well, that's because it just feels so weird. But I think, and don't forget that the scale that we're talking about is a point in time.
Yes.
So, when I did it, perhaps I was or wasn't feeling particularly humble, or, same with your results. Whereas you could do it next week and you've spent the whole day, in conversations caring about people. I might have done a whole long shift at Lifeline. And so empathy could be much higher. It's not an exam, and it's not telling you that you are or you're not a head or a heart leader. It's simply something for you to start having conversations with yourself or with others about your own leadership.
I do. I think it's a great conversation starter. And if I may plug your book, one of the questions this morning was around, well, okay, so people have read your book, what now? And I was sort of screaming at the screen to say, well, actually, it is all in the book. And whether you choose a coach, whether you choose one of the workshops that you facilitate, there's still so much in there to be able to start that process of reflection. And I think what I enjoyed so much about it was the fact that it's evidence-based. The amount of stories and interviews, and every single statement that you make, you then reference at the back. So it keeps it certainly kept me engaged. And I must have 30 half-read leadership books up on the bookshelf there. So there's a couple of things there that it is just for me to say it's super, super practical. And it's something that a leadership team could do together. It's, I'm sure it's the base. We need to say that you do executive coaching.
I do, although less and less. I'm enjoying the workshops. Are a lot of fun, actually, with groups. But yeah, you saying it's practical, that was definitely a goal. Evidence-based was absolutely a goal. And then just being a rollicking good read. I just wanted, I'm like you, I have so many half-read books as well. And I think, I wanted stories, and I like telling stories and, reading about interesting people. And I loved the diversity of the people that I got to speak with. They're not your usual people that we read about in leadership books, and yet they are absolutely leading.
And that was a challenge for me in the podcast, because I'm so passionate about storytelling, and there's in almost every page the stories that pop out, and I'm thinking, can you share some of the stories? But then I don't want I go back to when I read that story and the aha moment that I got from it. And I don't want to rob anybody else of the aha moment from the story. Do you get what I mean?
Oh, I do, particularly that first story, which
Oh,
I'm always getting asked about, but it's like a spoiler alert. I
no.
like people to read. So, anyone listening, I'm not going to tell you that story. Go and read the first few pages and see if you get hooked.
Oh, absolutely. Very, very much so. And I'm curious as well. I mean, when did you start researching this book? Because there's so
Yeah.
much in there.
I I don't know. I think the whole process for me takes about a year, and I'm already thinking about the next one now, and probably 4 months of writing, and I don't know, 6, 8 months of just on and off researching and just constantly reading, and then I have my little process, and I'm very as you said, I am very disciplined,
Mm.
and so had a whole sort of system for how I gathered all the data and how I got all of the research. But I'm so glad you noticed all the referencing, because nothing annoys me more than just people making stuff up or using someone else's ideas and not attributing it. So
Yes.
I'm absolutely crazy about making sure every single thing is attributed to wherever it should be. And I think it builds trust, as you said, that it is an evidence-based book, but not written in a way that sounds like a textbook.
Oh, exactly. It's exactly what you say. It's a rollicking good read. It's got the best of both worlds, and I'm exactly the same. Because if I actually was, I was in a presentation last week, and somebody put something up on the slide, and it broke rapport for me, because I'm saying, well, according to who? There's this,
And what's their motivational bias, or how did they test that? And I mean, it doesn't mean that everything needs to be so. I mean, there's interviews in there which are just anecdotes, really. They're people's opinions, but I think that's why you have to balance it all together.
And speaking, sort of leading from that into the interviews, you have such an eclectic, I suppose, breadth, array of people who you did consult with, who you did interview. Can you share maybe one that stood out, that was a surprise, or that you?
Yeah, I mean, and it really is from people like Mike Henry, who runs BHP, or Sally McManus, Secretary of the ACTU, through to teachers and actors and activists and scientists and you name it. One of the interviews I found the most fascinating was, from a lived experience so different to my own, and that was the trans activist and academic Eves Rees. And they spoke about, perspective and this skill of reading the room, which is so important, about how well honed that was for them, because they had learnt about entering rooms where they felt unsafe and having to judge, is a room safe or not, and what do I need to understand, and what's going on, what signals are happening. And they were really also very interesting in talking about their background, where they'd come from a very traditional leadership family. The parents were judges, from memory, judges and solicitors. And when they came out as trans, they found themselves leading from the margins, and what that looks like. And I just, I love being surprised by stories, and it is hard to pick a favorite because there are so many. Neerdal Nguyen, who is an Australian lawyer and human rights activist who grew up in, refugee camps, and she just had extraordinary stories of courage and what her mother went through. So all of them are really fascinating, but I really loved the stories that were most different to our normal lived experience.
Yeah, very much so. It's funny. I'm just looking through now, and I've got so many things that with orange that highlighted. But one of them here is that if can I read a little passage?
Of course.
So it's right towards the end in more of the how-to stuff, and it says, learning the art of being a modern leader has come with time and experience for business leader Miriam Silver. You can go through the hard work to integrate your head and heart leadership, but there is no shortcut, she says. You must work through the pain of learning about yourself and understand there are things that you'll need to change. And then it's funny, this is the other one I've highlighted. Academic and trans activist Eve Rees is excited by the new model of modern leadership, which they have seen as possible. It's the capacity to switch between modes, which is really the mark of a leader, knowing when to be playful, when to be humble, and when to be fierce, and not being afraid to show all those different sides rather than only seeking to be dominant all of the time.
Yeah, I know, such wisdom.
Ah.
Yeah, they're amazing. And just so many different leaders, and I loved talking to Claire Wright, who's a professor of history, and she couldn't understand why I was talking to her at all. And, she is a leader. When you look at everything that she has achieved, she is absolutely a leader. But for so many, unless, it's tied up in notions of that formal leadership, command and control, it's hard for people to see that they're leading.
Yeah. Which brings me on to that there's a number of times, and there's a couple of things that you say in the book that I'd love to just pick your brains a bit more on. The first one is that leadership is a series of moments. And the second, before I forget, is that everyone is a leader. Talk to me.
Oh my goodness, both of those are massive concepts in the book. Let's start with the second one first. Everyone is a leader. Of course, that doesn't mean we're all the CEO. That would be chaotic. But I do believe that everyone is leading, whether they intend to or not. And it might just be in their families, or it might be in the way you conduct yourself. If you're I use the example of a supermarket checkout operator during the pandemic who led in a really difficult moment with a terrible customer. They are leading even though they don't have, business cards and employees and things like that. It might be personal leadership, but they're still leading. The idea that leadership is a series of moments, that has come from, this story that we're not talking about that's in the first few pages. And then when I think about, every moment you look back on, it's hard not to see them as moments where you can really make a difference, or moments where you can totally shatter someone's confidence and do a terrible job as a leader. And so I think the more we realize that every moment is this opportunity to leave a positive legacy, I think it means we don't need to think about what the next 50 years are going to look like or whatever it is. It's just think about today. What are the moments where you're going to really make a difference today?
Absolutely. And as you're saying that, I think back to a pivotal moment in my sort of management career, early days, where I had a team of 16 people, and there was a young intern who had the courage to feed back to me that I was micromanaging, and my level of self-awareness was, I thought I was a great manager. I thought I was empowering and trusting. And she just turned around and said, Claire, it doesn't matter what we do, it'll never be good enough for you. And that was absolute gold. I still haven't found her to thank her. But when you say a series of moments, that was, that was a huge learning moment for me. And linking into my head and heart leader scale, self-awareness is down at number 6. So what does that say, Kirstin?
Well, it probably means that you could perhaps, focus a little more on getting some feedback, maybe, or, because it might be a bit more challenging to know the impact that you're having on others. And I think for all of us, self-awareness is really difficult. 95% of us think we're self-aware, and something like 10 to 15% of us actually are, as judged by those we lead. So all of us have blind spots. Knowing when, your emotions are about to overtake you. I use the example in the book, as you know, of Will Smith taking the stage at the Oscars. He had what is called an amygdala hijack. He definitely was not regulating his emotions. If you can, and I'm not suggesting that this is a challenge for you, but for some, and I'm one where most of the time I can stop myself from shooting off an email where I'm really cranky or, picking up the phone, but not always. And sometimes I realize it too late. And, fortunately, never has had significant impact, but I always feel really terrible afterwards that I haven't caught myself in that moment. And that's where, that self-awareness of, okay, what's going on in your body, when you've just got that fire, you can't even think straight, you've got to reply straight away. And I think recognizing that is all about self-awareness, and we can all work on that all the time.
So dare I ask, what were a couple of things that you must have done your own self-assessment, and I know it's point in time, but were there any aha moments for you in the one that you did?
Well, yes, always. And I was surprised. The wisdom one surprised me, and it didn't surprise me, I think, because it was, I like to think I know how to make really good decisions. And I think it's sometimes I do.
Mm-hmm.
But I reckon I do have a tendency to just go, that sounds great, let's do it, and then figure it out. My humility and self-awareness were quite high.
Mm-hmm.
I think my ability to read the room was higher than the norm group. But then, my curiosity was a little bit lower, and I was surprised about that. I'm a bit less curious than everyone else, and that isn't what I was expecting. And my capability is a bit less. And that's really not around your ability to do your job. It's really around how much you believe, you can do well at your job, and how much you feel constant and never-ending improvement is an important part of being better. And so they're just all things for you to take away and think about. And as I said earlier, it doesn't mean you don't have all these things. And of course, wisdom for me, of course, there are times I'm incredibly disciplined around my decision making, but it also shows that there's times where I'm not, and that I can work on that.
Yeah. And I had a similar reflection in my one. So capability for me was at 7 and wisdom was at 8.
Yeah.
And how I read that was the capability is around being self-employed and a little bit of imposter syndrome and a little bit of comparing to others. And I think the wisdom is sometimes in my enthusiasm to, oh, come on, let's just do it. And I don't have that responsibility for other people at this point in time. So, and I think it is such a great tool for self-reflection, for discussion, and as a basis for development. And I've just looked at how long we've been chatting, and I'm going to have to wrap this up.
We could chat all day, but for anyone listening, please go and visit headheartleader.com, because you'll get your report too.
Yes, I can't emphasize that more. And I will, if you follow Kirstin on LinkedIn, I'll put your LinkedIn details there, and I'll put the website details on there. And just, I know how busy you are, Kirstin. I am so appreciative of not just your time, but your honesty, your humor. I've loved every minute of it. Thank you.
It was such a pleasure to be here.
Go well.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks for listening, and we hope that this conversation provided the insights and inspiration that you were looking for. Did you know that Rawthentic Leadership is currently ranking 6th in the top 25 Australian leadership podcasts? You can help us get to number 1 by heading over to Apple iTunes and doing 3 quick things. 1, subscribing. 2, giving us a positive rating. And 3, writing a short review. This is the most effective way for us to get the key messages around 21st century leadership out into the community. And before you go, if you're in the business of learning and development or HR and are looking for a facilitator or speaker, let's talk. You can head over to the BrainSmart website, that's brain-smart.com, to see examples of our programs, or email me, Claire, that's CLARE, at brain-smart.com. Go well, and thanks for listening.